My name is Harold Furchtgott-Roth, and I'd like to welcome you here to the Hudson Institute and the Center for the Economics of the Internet. We are very pleased today to have a very special guest, Ajit Pai, former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Chairman Pai has had a long and distinguished career in both the private and the public sector. He served as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from January of 2017 through January of 2021. Chairman Pai, welcome to the Hudson Institute.
Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth, it's an honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
It seems like just yesterday that you were here. It was spring of 2021, it's 5 years ago now, spring of 2017, sorry, 5 years ago. And you introduced this great idea to reorganize the FCC to address economic issues. Can you tell us about that?
I'd be happy to. First and foremost, thanks for all the support you gave me during my time at the Commission, including the past 4 years as chairman. You obviously set the mold for service at the Commission as a member during the late 1990s and early 2000s, and all of us have been chasing your example ever since. So the extent that we got some great things done is because of the vision and the integrity that you had at the Commission to serve as a role model for us. So.
No, you're way too kind. No, you were greatest chairman we had for quite a while.
Oh, well, you're very, very kind in turn. But it's funny, walking into the Hudson Institute, I was thinking to myself, what a warm memory it was 5 years ago this year when we introduced the concept of formalizing and centralizing the economic function at the Commission. As you know, Harold, lawyers have an Office of General Counsel, engineers have an Office of Engineering Technology, but at the time when I took office, the economists and data scientists were kind of sprinkled throughout the agency in an ad hoc fashion. Some bureaus and some offices had fewer than others, and by and large, they didn't have a seat at the table when it came to formulating and executing some of the policy decisions the Commission was proposing to make. And so I sat down and I thought, well, why don't we set up an Office of Economics and Analytics so that they have a formal role, they have a formal office, and they will have a seat and be able to introduce cost-benefit analysis in a more rigorous way, at least inform us about some of the puts and takes when it comes to structuring spectrum auctions and all those types of things. And when we thought about where to roll out this proposal, it wasn't really much of a debate. I mean, you were obviously a fantastic economist, voice for economics during your time at the Commission, and continued that, of course, here at Hudson. And so 5 years ago, rolled out the proposal, and at least in the audience, from what I could tell, we got really good feedback. And thereafter, it was incredible to hear people over the years, some of whom got in touch who I'd never heard of, but who'd worked at the Commission in, say, the 70s or 80s or 90s and said, it's about time. This is a proposal whose time has come, long since passed, and we really support what you're trying to do. And so then we had to set up a working group and do all that necessary legwork to bring it to fruition for the Commission's consideration.
So it got widespread support, and it seems like every time there's a new chairman, there's a little bit of reorganization. So did it just take place immediately?
No, that's sort of they were breaking me in as chairman. The chairman proposes something, it doesn't happen the next day, of course. And so we had a series of working groups. We had to work with the labor union that represents some FCC employees. We also had to work with the appropriations committees that had to approve of certain reorganization proposals. And all of that took some time. And then also internally, I wanted to vet it among different constituencies within the Commission, and not just the economists and the data scientists who'd be in the office, but also with the commissioners as well. And so that took a lot of time as well. I wanted to make sure that everybody knew what we were planning to do and how we were going to do it. And it just took longer than I would have expected. So we rolled out the proposal in the spring. The FCC didn't formally adopt the proposal until late, I think it was December actually of 2017. So it took quite some time. And even then it ended up being a 3-2 vote, unfortunately, which
wow.
It was a disappointment, but we got it done, and that's the important thing at the end of the day.
Mr. Chairman, you were at the Commission for many years before you became chairman. During that period of time, were there a lot of complaints about ISPs blocking access to certain websites? Was that a common complaint?
Not at all. I remember when I was a staff lawyer in the Office of General Counsel in 2007, 2008, I actually worked on the Comcast BitTorrent issue that ended up generating one of the first rounds of litigation the FCC was embroiled in on this issue. And it was notable to me even then that in that context, there was one episode that people were focusing on and another from North Carolina, Madison River from the 2005. And I always thought, my gosh, if this was that common of a practice to warrant commission regulation, one would expect a much broader market failure. But these are typically isolated cases. We didn't see many complaints like that at all. In fact, things like your broadcast indecency dwarfed complaints about the throttling or blocking of internet content.
So there weren't a lot of complaints about blocking.
No, not at all.
There weren't a lot of complaints about throttling.
No.
Not a lot of complaints about paid prioritization.
No, absolutely not.
So let me get this straight. We have this concept called network neutrality, which prohibits blocking, throttling, paid prioritization. But there weren't really a lot of complaints about it and not really a lot of practice of that. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
And this is the biggest issue on the regulation of the internet?
It is truly incredible how much effort and time has been spent on this issue, considering the fact that in the lives of millions of online consumers, this is not something that ever affects their online experience. It's quite stunning when you think about it, how much time the agency has spent, not just during my tenure, but over the years. I mean, dating back to Chairman Powell's time in the early 2000s. And it's really unfortunate because, to me at least, the FCC's core function, as exhibited in Section 1 of the Communications Act, is to make these services available to all the people of the United States. It's not to micromanage harms that haven't even materialized. And to me, at least, if you ask the average person on the street, what do you think the predicate for any type of regulation should be? I would think they would say, well, there must be some concrete problem that you're trying to solve. You know, consumers must be being harmed, or there's some broken marketplace in terms of competition. If none of those things have materialized, then why is the federal bureaucracy spinning its wheels? What shouldn't it be focused on actual problems? And that's one of the great mysteries, I think, about net neutrality is I've never quite understood why so much angst has been poured into this issue, especially when, from a perspective of those who care about a free and open internet, the threats certainly come from elsewhere, not from the network operator perspective.
So you become chairman and you try to roll back these rules that were addressing problems that don't really exist.
Right.
And was that an easy process?
Oh, it was pretty easy, kind of quiet. It flew under the radar, but AM radio, that was the one that people really seized upon during December 2017. But no, it was a pretty vituperative process, both within the commission and outside of the commission. And look, I knew it was going to be a 3-2 vote. Historically, this has been one of the issues on which commissioners have been sharply divided. What I didn't expect and certainly did not welcome was some of the more personal blowback, I guess you might say, threats to me and my family, and just bomb threats being phoned into the commission, and some of the other things that went along with it. Pizzas being sent to our house 3 in the morning, my parents and in-laws getting calls on their home phones cursing them out, and my email account getting hacked. I mean, these types of things, which I just simply don't think have any place in American discourse. And that's something that I don't miss at all about my time at the commission, and I certainly hope that none of my successors ever have to go through that again.
Well, my sense is that network neutrality rules will be considered by the new commission when it's fully comprised. But I have maybe I'm wrong, but my sense is the angst and public volume on this issue is nowhere near as loud as it was
completely
4 or 5 years ago.
Without question, there's no doubt about it. And I think part of the reason is that some of our betters, people in the media, politicians, celebrities, promised the American people that the parade of horribles was going to happen. One of the famous tweets from Banksy, of all people, says, you're going to have to pay $14.99 per month just to access Twitter. Bernie Sanders, that expert on internet regulation, said, this is the end of the internet as we know it. A columnist in the New York Times said that the FCC was snuffing the internet out with a pillow. I mean, all of these ridiculous predictions. And over time, given that none of them have materialized, I think the average person out there is thinking, wow, what on earth were we so concerned about? And even now, if you go on Twitter and you type in net neutrality in my name, you'll find a huge number of people who will say, almost in a nostalgic way, hey, remember back in 2017 when we hated this guy over this issue? What was that all about? Did anything ever happen? And it's just incredible. And I think part of the reason is that people's lived experience is so much better. I mean, fixed broadband speeds in the United States, according to Ookla, not according to the FCC or me, are up 174% today compared to when I took office, when we made that decision. Mobile broadband speeds are up over 300%. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. And from a network operator perspective, the internet is open and free. They're not blocking content or throttling content. There's no paid prioritization or other anti-competitive conduct. And so I think the fact that consumers are better off today just has opened their eyes to the fact that they were sold a bill of goods back in 2017. So look, this is an article of religious faith among a few activists here in Washington. So they're going to badger the new FCC, once fully constituted, into reinstituting these rules. And the FCC will have to go through the charade of, okay, there's a great danger looming over the internet, and here's why we're going to impose Title II once again. But it's again, as I said back in 2015 when I dissented from the Obama administration's imposition of these rules, this is a solution that won't work to a problem that doesn't exist. I believed it then, and I think it's even more clearly true now.
Let's talk about an issue of an industry that largely has died. That might be the newspaper industry and the broadcast industry, which is struggling. And going back to Chairman Powell's time of efforts to get rid of some of the broadcast ownership rules, that got stuck in court, stuck in the Third Circuit for forever. Tell us about that and what you did as chairman to try to dislodge that case from the Third Circuit.
I'd be happy to. I'll frame it, though, by saying that to anyone who's watching this under the age of 40, the entire edifice of these rules must sound completely ridiculous. I mean, it must sound like old people debating about, who lost China back in 1949. I mean, what's the relevance of this anymore? And the reason is that Congress, the FCC instituted back in 1975, a lot of rules by which the FCC would structure preemptively how the media marketplace should be, how ownership could be held. And so there's a prohibition, as you know, on the joint ownership of a newspaper and a broadcast TV or radio station. There were certain rules on the number of TV stations you can own in a particular market, a number of radio stations, et cetera. There's an 8 voices test. I mean, all these ridiculous rules. And I remember working on this when I was a lawyer under Chairman Martin, and he was proposing to tweak just a little bit the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule. And the uproar was incredible back in 2007, 2008. I mean, you would have thought that your democracy was about to die if a newspaper and a broadcast TV station in Ottumwa, Iowa were allowed to join forces. And I could see then what is patently obvious today, which is that the newspaper industry is really struggling. Subscriptions are down, people are going digital. They really need to be able to explore pro-competitive combinations. So I vowed to myself, the 2007 effort having gotten bottled up in the Third Circuit, I vowed to myself if I was ever in a position to be in the corner office, I would do my best to make sure that we updated these rules. And not to deregulate for the sake of deregulating, but simply making sure that our rules were calibrated to the marketplace of 2017, not the marketplace of 1975. And so we did that in 2017. We proposed to get rid of the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule and to deregulate some of the other rules that we thought had long since outlived their usefulness. Here too, another 3-2 vote. Here too, the Third Circuit decided to rule against us. And this time, for the first time ever, the FCC decided we're not going to let a 2-judge majority on the Third Circuit panel set media ownership policy for a generation. I mean, they've been ruling against the FCC for decades, and no one has sought higher review. So we sought cert through the Department of Justice successfully. The Supreme Court agreed to take it. And in April of 2021, I was thrilled that in a 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court said, yes, the FCC does have the authority to adjust these rules. It does have the statutory authority. And from an administrative law perspective, we dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's we needed to. So, I wish they had done so sooner so that we could actually implement further deregulation. But going forward, at least, we did our part with the time we were given to make sure that these rules match the marketplace. But hats off to you and to Chairman Powell and even Chairman Janikowski too. I mean, he tried, and Chairman Martin, at a time when these rules, if repealed or revised, could really have had a materially positive impact on the industry. I mean, I hope it's not too late now. And I've been to a lot of these smaller markets where it's increasingly hard to keep the lights on for some of these newspaper or broadcast stations. And so I wish it could have been done sooner, but better late than never.
Let's switch from old technologies to technologies on the frontier.
Yeah.
5G and new wireless services. Lots of progress made during your chairmanship. Tell us a bit about some of the things that you were doing both here in the United States and internationally to allow technology to move forward.
It was a lot of work, I can tell you, but it was a labor of love for me, because one of the things I noticed when I became a commissioner in 2012 is that the United States had only 4% of the world's population, but at the time we had 50% of the world's 4G LTE connections, and that resulted in a flow of capital into the United States, talent coming to the United States to build things like the mobile app economy that we all benefit from. And when I became chair, I saw that 5G was poised to be the next generation of wireless connectivity with all of the benefits, nationally speaking, that flow from that. And so we wanted to make sure that we put the building blocks in place for entrepreneurs and innovators to set up shop here, to spend the capital, to hire the people, to do the work, to make sure that America was the leader in 5G. But it required us to have a comprehensive strategy, and so we rolled out, along with Larry Kudlow, the director of the National Economic Council at the White House, what we call the 5G FAST Plan, a plan for facilitating America's superiority in 5G technologies. And that plan had three basic parts. Number one, freeing up more spectrum for the commercial marketplace. And number two, making it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure, which of course is one of the key inputs. And three, one of the less heralded but nonetheless vital aspects of a 5G network, making sure that fiber penetration was much deeper, because fiber is necessary to backhaul all of that traffic into the core of wireless networks. And I think by anybody's measure, we executed incredibly successfully on each of those different planks of the plan. Spectrum alone, I mean, we held so many spectrum auctions, 24 gigahertz band, 28, 37, 39, 41, the 3.5 gigahertz band, as well as CBRS, the C-band auction, the largest spectrum auction in American history in terms of gross proceeds. And we put in place the 3.4 and 2.5 auctions. So we were pretty aggressive on that front. And even on the Wi-Fi side as well, Wi-Fi being a complement to 5G, opened up the entire 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi, freed up a slice of the 5.9 gigahertz band. So spectrum-wise, I think it's fair to say that we were the most aggressive FCC in history, to the benefit of consumers and innovators alike. On the wireless infrastructure side as well, we just cleared out some of the underbrush. You set a shot clock for cities and other jurisdictions to approve some of these siting applications, and sped up the deployment of cell sites substantially. By last time we checked anyway, 7,000 cell sites were deployed from 2013 to 2016, 87,000 from 2017 until 2020, and that's only going to increase into the future. And in terms of fiber deployment, as a result of some of the regulation that we revised or repealed, fiber deployment set a record in 2018 in terms of deployment in the United States, a record that was broken in 2019, and then, as I understand it, again in 2020. So on each of those different vectors, I think we did the hard work that allowed some of these companies to really build networks and take advantage of the spectrum assets that will enable American consumers to get better, faster wireless services. Still a lot more work to do, of course, but I think at least based on where we were in January 21 when I left, things looked pretty bright.
One of the areas to get more broadband to the American consumer, particularly in rural areas, is universal service, and,
Yeah.
and you had some advances there, and for the first time in auction to serve unserved areas.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. And here too, I have to credit our friends in the world of economics. It seems like such an obvious innovation, but in the world of the Universal Service Fund, as you know, there are a lot of public choice difficulties that stand in the way of introducing some of those innovations. So for a long time, for those who might not be familiar, the Universal Service Fund, which is about a $10 billion annual fund that the FCC oversees, has been focused on providing more connectivity in rural areas. And as you know, it essentially involves cutting a check to a rural telephone company and saying, we hope you use these funds to build out broadband in these rural areas. And one of the things we thought was, well, why don't we introduce the concept of reverse auctions? Instead of just cutting the check, encourage competition so that for a given geographic area, companies using any technology, so long as they meet certain service thresholds and meet accountability metrics, should be eligible to compete for those subsidies. And we introduced that in my second month in office in 2017, started holding these auctions, culminating in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction. And now I think it's commonplace, even under the new administration. I think reverse auctions are going to be the norm. And one of the interesting things is it dramatically reduces the expected spend from some of these rural subsidy programs. The RDOF, for example, we expected phase one to be about $16 billion. It was only $9 billion. The Connect America Fund, it was expected to be budgeted to be $5 billion, ended up being $1.5 billion. And because you have that competition, as you know, that drives down the price, a better deal for the taxpayer at the end of the day. And so here I was really proud of some of the work we did on the reverse auction side. And even on the accountability side as well. I mean, we started instituting requirements that, look, if you get the money, you've got to do what you say you're going to do. It's not enough just to have the press release on day one. We need to see boots on the ground and networks at the end of the day. And so there too, I'm confident that that's one of the other things that's going to persist well into the future now that I'm gone.
Can that reverse auction framework be applied to other areas of universal service, like schools and libraries and low-income programs?
I don't see why not. I mean, in theory, it's a better deal for the taxpayer. The recipient of the benefit is still getting the best bang for the buck as well. So to me, I think it's just being a wise steward of taxpayer funds. And I don't think people out there realize that when you have a program that isn't subject to market mechanisms, there are all sorts of dangers in terms of public choice. What I mean by public choice, it's a company becomes very wedded to having a revenue stream coming from the federal government. They enlist lobbyists and politicians and others to start badgering the FCC to say, we want to keep that revenue stream going, and if you cut it down or open it up to competition, people are going to suffer, or companies are going to go under, or consumers are going to be worse off, even though we know that's not true from other parts of the world. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important, introducing market mechanisms to take the place of some of the other, not necessarily nefarious, but just some of the backroom dealings or the potential for taxpayers to get fleeced. And that's just not something I just don't think it's right as a public policy matter for that to happen. So I would love to see it introduced more broadly.
Let's talk about some of the services on the internet and some topics that have become intensely debated just in the past few years, and probably were not when you first became chairman. Section 230 particularly comes to mind. Section 230 is a safe harbor for essentially online platforms to avoid liability for content that third parties might post on them. This has suddenly become a very, very hot topic. Tell us a bit about Section 230, and it just became an intense issue towards the end of your chairmanship, but I'd say the intensity of interest has only grown over time. Tell us a bit about Section 230.
Sure. So Section 230 was adopted by Congress in 1996 as part of the Telecommunications Act. It's codified for the legal geeks out there in Title 47 of the United States Code, which is significant for a reason I'll get to shortly. And it essentially says that online platforms, internet content companies, are not necessarily liable for the things that users post on those platforms. And it was spurred by a couple of cases in the mid-1990s at the dawn of the commercial internet. And one of the concerns Congress had at the time was, if I'm just hosting a forum and somebody, not without my knowledge or approval, posts something that creates liability for me, that could essentially inhibit the development of the internet over time. So they instituted Section 230, which has several different sections, Section 230B, Section 230C, but that's sort of the core part of it, is to say that if 230C in particular says that if a company does something in good faith to moderate a platform, and it has certain enlisted categories and says and removes things that are otherwise objectionable, it's not subject to liability for doing that. And so one of the questions that has arisen over the last couple of years is, are these platforms in fact abiding by some of the expectations that Congress had when they instituted Section 230 back in the 1990s? And it's kind of funny, because to me, this has a nice flip side to the net neutrality debate. Back in 2017, when I rolled out in a speech, November 2017, my announcement that I was going to be proposing to the Commission to get rid of the net neutrality rules, I said, look, for those of you who are concerned about a free and open internet, there is a danger out there in terms of the blocking of content, of lawful content. It comes actually from these internet platforms, which are not transparent, which can block people whenever they want. And ironically, it's these very same companies that are coming to Washington saying, we demand strict net neutrality rules to regulate our network operator rivals. And I remember at the time after that speech, a reporter told one of my aides, who then told me, this reporter whispered to one of my aides, I can't believe he's going after these tech platforms. I mean, they're the sacred cows of Washington, of the United States, and they're the golden children. Fast forward to 2021 and 2022, when this issue has become really live, I don't think any sentient human being with a shred of intellectual integrity could maintain that network operators today are a bigger threat to what people can say and what they see on the internet than some of these platforms, these online platforms. I mean, it's quite clear now that there is no transparency into how decisions are made or why they're made, and that they're made somewhat arbitrarily. I mean, people are always trying to figure out post hoc. And so I think that's part of the reason why on both sides of the aisle, you now see Democrats and Republicans in Congress talking about changes to Section 230. President Biden, for his part, during the 2020 campaign, explicitly campaigned on getting rid of Section 230 altogether. So the Department of Commerce, when I was chairman, petitioned the FCC to take a look at Section 230 and to figure out whether or not there should be regulations adopted or some other action taken. And I asked our general counsel to just tell us what the lay of the land is from a legal perspective. Do we have the authority to even interpret this section? And the general counsel came back and said, yes, we do. Number one, it's codified as part of Title 47, which is obviously what animates the FCC to take action anyway. Secondly, Section 201B says that the FCC has the authority to essentially give meaning to all of the sections within this act, and Section 230 is a part of that. Moreover, the Supreme Court said in AT&T versus Iowa Utilities Board during your time at the commission that the agency did have the authority to essentially interpret all of Title II. And so from a legal perspective, it was fairly clear to me, based on the general counsel's opinion, that the FCC had authority to move forward. And then the question became, well, what, if anything, should we do? And here, it was October, I think, was when the general counsel rendered the opinion, or somewhere in the late fall. And it was the last month or so that the decision was finally put to me. And I thought, we just don't have time to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, put it on the FCC agenda, and so we'll leave it for a future administration to think about. And so I know this is a very hot issue on every side, and people are really angry about it, but I think, to me at least, Congress is going to have to decide what, if anything, to do about Section 230. But I do think that there's a role for perhaps the Federal Trade Commission to say, look, everybody, the FCC, when it repealed the Title II rules in 2017, said ISPs have to abide by a transparency requirement. They have to, as my third grade math teacher would say, show your work, describe your network management practices and reveal to consumers basics about their plan, et cetera. Why shouldn't tech platforms have to do the same thing? I don't see any principled reason against it, why anyone would be opposed to transparency. And so I do think that there is a role for conversations, even outside of this context of Section 230 reform, for some of the platforms to abide by the same rules. And Commissioner Carr, who's now at the FCC, has talked about what he calls full stack net neutrality. Essentially, if we're going to have net neutrality for network operators, we should have it for tech platforms as well. And I think that's part of the shift in the conversation that we definitely did not see back in 2017.
You mentioned Congress is going to have to address this. There's some observers who think that Congress will debate it, but probably not actually passing the legislation.
Yeah.
Do you think there will be a role for the FCC to come up with rules under Section 230, or you think that's probably not going to happen?
If I had to guess, it's probably not going to happen in the current administration. It could, but I think it's something that the current commission probably would not want to tackle because Congress is debating it, and so they would probably say, as an initial matter, we'll see how things play out on Capitol Hill. And then if nothing happens over a couple of years, we might take a second look. But I tend to doubt that they would take action over in the near term anyway. So we'll see what happens.
Another internet issue, or two related internet issues. One is cybersecurity, the other is privacy, and potential roles for the FCC, Federal Trade Commission, other federal agencies, state agencies. Internationally, different groups having different privacy rules. How do you see this shaping out? What is the future of privacy and cybersecurity on the internet?
It's a great question. I would like to say that there was a good prospect of federal privacy legislation happening because right now we are essentially in the United States governed de facto by California, California's privacy regime, and the GDPR in Europe. And this is another issue that I wish Congress could address, which is that all of these internet protocol-based technologies or platforms are interstate in nature. And so it seems to me that it follows from that no particular state should have a de facto national regulatory regime. And so I would like Congress to put on the page, especially in the context of privacy, some of the basic rules of the road so that people can innovate around them. And I think the FTC during the Obama administration and the early part of the Trump administration had a more light touch approach to privacy, one that stemmed from the Federal Trade Commission's historic understanding that generally speaking, consumers opted in implicitly to sharing some information in exchange for getting some services. And that was generally a trade that seemed to work for most consumers. Maybe there's a privacy regime that Congress could enact similar to that would be more light touch in nature and that would give everybody an understanding of what the rules are. But unfortunately here too, it's always been bogged down on Capitol Hill. It doesn't seem to go anywhere, and I tend to be skeptical that anything's going to happen. On cyber, it's a little bit of a different story. I mean, I'm skeptical here too that Congress will pass comprehensive legislation, and I tend to doubt that we would want them micromanaging cybersecurity standards well into the future. But there are targeted rifle shots that Congress has taken, even during my time, that I was really proud of. And so, for example, we were the first FCC to start raising a concern about some of the insecure equipment coming into our networks or that had already been installed in our networks, companies like Huawei and ZTE in particular. And so we raised this flag. We did what we could within the FCC's authority by banning the use of USF funds from being used by carriers on insecure equipment or services from the companies like that. But we didn't have the ability to tell some of the carriers that had already incorporated this equipment, you have to get rid of it at your own cost. And so we worked with Congress, and Congress did set up a program to essentially rip and replace that equipment. And that involved a lot of legwork. I had to talk to members of this House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle and tell them this is really important. I know you've got a lot of bigger things you may be fighting about, but national security should be the one thing that we can agree on. And to their credit, they largely did. They set up a program. They gave us some of the tools we needed to do the job. So I'm hopeful that this is one of the rare oases from some of the partisan bickering that we've typically seen in Washington, and we'll see how things play out going forward. I hope the new commission continues to give the technical assistance to Congress that it needs and the briefings that Congress needs in order to do the job on this issue.
There does seem to be bipartisan interest in both privacy and cybersecurity.
Yeah.
One of my students this past semester wrote a fascinating paper on essentially privacy and cybersecurity software in the schools and libraries program and the complete absence of it, and essentially students at schools being targets for specific types of advertising and hacking. So there probably are some things the commission could do further on its own in this area.
I think that's a great idea, and within any of the universal service fund programs, if you're expending funds for a particular purpose, then you should have the right to condition that on abiding by certain basic regulations when it comes to cybersecurity, and I don't think that's unreasonable. So, and I'm pretty sure that would be would comport with the Communications Act and all the precedents. So,
I think it's probably there.
I would certainly commend it to my successor's attention.
There's a lot of competition in communications industries, and for the past 25 years, there've been a lot of merger activity and commission review of those mergers, in parallel with reviews by the antitrust agencies. You had a couple of major mergers as chairman. Tell us a bit about that and coordination or lack thereof with the federal antitrust agencies, and how, think big picture, how should the federal government look at mergers in a specific industry?
Oh boy, how much time do we have on this one? So, I remember cutting my teeth as a baby lawyer in 1998 at the Department of Justice, where I was assigned to the antitrust division, and I remember thinking at the time, why is the DOJ fighting with the FTC over who gets to handle a particular merger in the telecom sector? And then on top of that, why does the FCC have essentially duplicative review? It never made any sense to me. And so for starters, I think the time has come for Congress to vest plenary authority to review mergers in either the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice. My own preference would be the Department of Justice, because I just know it better, and I think the Antitrust Division historically has done great work. But I don't understand why there are essentially two different agencies doing the same job, applying potentially different standards with a different body of precedent growing up, and it just doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, then you bring in the FCC to do its own review. And over the years, as you know as well as I do, the FCC's review is based on the public interest standard, a standard that can be quite elastic depending on the majority that is willing to apply it. And one of the things that I complained about when I was a commissioner was that the public interest standard had essentially become sort of a de facto backroom negotiating deal, where the chairman sat down with the merging parties and said, it's a nice transaction there. It'd be a shame if anything had to happen to it, and extracted conditions, some of which were completely extraneous to the merits of the transaction. They were designed to ameliorate any particular anti-competitive harm. And so one of the things I thought as a commissioner, and we tried to do when I was chairman, was to infuse the public interest standard with more of the sense of antitrust. Traditional tools of antitrust should be applied to give that standard meaning. And so in the context of T-Mobile and Sprint, for example, we perceived that the combination of the two could have an anti-competitive effect on the prepaid market. And so we thought, okay, it's important for the combined entity to divest Boost Mobile, which was a Sprint brand, and which the companies ultimately did to Dish. But we didn't sit here and say, okay, well, we're going to buy off this constituency by forcing the companies to, buy 100,000 computers. We're not going to buy off this constituency. I mean, that's just not, that has nothing to do with transactional review and everything to do with transactional costs that are more political in nature. And so we didn't do that. And I think over time, assuming future commissions abide by that standard, I think you'll see the Department of Justice and FTC on one hand and the FCC on the other hand working more hand in glove. I mean, I personally work very closely with my counterpart at the Antitrust Division, Macon Delrahim, who he and I did a great job, I think it's fair to say, just collaborating and calling each other whenever, hey, there was a heads up, or I would ask him for documents that he thought were particularly salient that we might not have access to. Our teams worked very closely together as well, the career staff. So we wanted to make sure that if there was a disagreement about a particular issue, that disagreement didn't arise because of a lack of coordination. We didn't want to have two completely different cops on the beat trying to go after the same crime, so to speak. And so anyway, going forward, if I had a magic wand, I would just wave it and say, plenary authority, antitrust authority in one agency, and potentially the FCC in a consultative role to provide technical expertise and the like. But barring that, at least, making sure that the FCC adopts more of an antitrust-based approach to its work?
I think just earlier this week, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice announced they're going to I think, jointly review antitrust guidelines, which have been in place for a very long time, for decades, and have been largely upheld by the courts. This may be a little bit far afield, but do you have any views on that? Are there problems with the antitrust merger guidelines?
I mean, I've reviewed those merger guidelines pretty closely ever since I was a law student at the University of Chicago in the 1990s. And they were formulated with great care over a great many years. And to me, at least, I think they're properly calibrated to discern potential competitive harm from proposed transactions, either horizontal or vertical. And so, could they stand to be tweaked? I suppose, based on what the nature of the tweak is. But all too often, what I hear these days is simply sort of a reflexive view that the consumer welfare standard is bad, or harm might not be manifested in higher price. It can manifest in different ways that we can't really identify with precision, but nonetheless we know are there. It's sort of a more impressionistic view of antitrust. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be, because ultimately what you're saying is it's not necessarily the facts in the record, but the views of the regulator that are going to carry the day. And then it becomes just a political issue. Well, who are the political appointees in charge of that particular agency? That I don't think is, for either side of the aisle, is a good place to be. And so I would much rather, I know it sounds boring and it's unpopular in some quarters these days, but just simply do the hard work of trying to discern anti-competitive harm. I mean, at the end of the day, are consumers better off or worse off from the consummation of a transaction? That's pretty much, I mean, I'm hard-pressed to think of why that's controversial. And if they are worse off, are there conditions that can be narrowly tailored to address that harm? And if the answer to that is no, okay, then you block a merger. But you're simply saying, oh, this company is big, we don't like them, or they're unpopular, we don't like them, or we just perceive that the market would be better structured this way. I mean, that's not the type of regulatory humility, I think, certainly won't stand up in court, but also won't stand up in the long-term court of public opinion, because consumers are going to be worse off for innovations that don't happen, or the combinations that could produce benefits that aren't realized. So it's, it might be a voice in the wilderness at this point, but hopefully there are some other intrepid economists like you alongside me.
A lot of markets, both on the equipment side and increasingly on the service side, are global in nature. It's not a local market. It's not even a national market. It's a global market, whether it's for software or equipment or apps. Tell us a bit about your experience in international fora and working with other governments around the world, and how that has played out, and then we'll move on to some of the specific global markets that we're dealing with. What was your experience in working with other governments and with international bodies?
It was fascinating. I remember when I was a commissioner under Chairman Janikowski, he mentioned that the international work comprised a bigger percentage of his time than he anticipated, and I kind of filed that in the back of my head. Didn't know what to expect when I became chair. But it was certainly a huge amount of work, and good work, because essentially the chair is the point person for all of the regulators around the world. And so I was pretty active on the international front. On security, for example, I personally went to a lot of countries around the world, from Malaysia to Israel to Germany, and talked to some of our counterpart communications agencies and counterpart security agencies about some of the concerns that we had as the United States government writ large about 5G security issues, including those involving Huawei and other insecure network equipment providers. And we did that jointly with, say, the Department of Homeland Security or the National Security Council, the State Department, and other agencies. So it really was a team effort. And we made a lot of progress. In 2019, the Prague proposals, 32 countries came together in Prague, in the Czech Republic, to say that we agree with a risk-based framework for evaluating the security of next-generation networks. And at the time, it was thought there's no way you're going to be able to herd all these cats. The U.S. is an outlier in thinking this is an important issue. And the product proposals, which emerged in 2019, really served as a blueprint, whereas now most countries around the world, I think, would at least admit that this is an important issue to take into consideration. Even aside from security, though, I did a lot of work just working with my counterparts on spectrum issues or other issues where harmonization might yield greater benefits around the world and here in the United States. Spectrum is a great example. I mean, every 4 years, as folks out there might know, the International Telecommunications Union hosts the World Radio Communication Conference, where a lot of countries get together and try to hash out for particular spectrum bands that this is what we think this band would be ideally suited for, satellite services or wireless services, et cetera. And to many Americans, you might wonder, well, what do we care if other countries use it for a different purpose? But to the extent that there's harmonization, that means that equipment providers and wireless companies and others can innovate around that at scale and drive a lot of capital into building these next generation services. And so through the regional fora in Latin America and Central America, through some of the international fora from Japan to India, I mean, I was on the road a lot trying to talk to my counterparts about let's move forward in a 5G environment to make sure there enough spectrum is available. And that ended up producing a lot of benefits at the WRC in 2019. And it wasn't pretty, but I can tell you that if we hadn't put in all that work, the United States would not have achieved such a successful result. And here, I have to give credit to the amazing International Bureau staff at the FCC. I mean, these folks know every jot and tittle of every spectrum issue, every telecom issue under the sun, and they work mightily on behalf of the United States with all of these different countries. And it was just great to see the FCC's staff working together to help achieve this result. The other plug I'll make on the international side, I'm really proud of it personally. The ITU is governed by essentially a Secretary General and then a few deputies. And those folks are elected by the membership, essentially all the member states that participate in the ITU. There had never been a woman elected to one of those positions, and there had not been an American in, I think, many, many decades. And so we had a candidate, Doreen Bogman-Martin, who we introduced, or who we supported and actively worked for, and she ultimately ended up getting elected back in 2018, I believe it was, at the plenipotentiary in Dubai. And that was a pretty special moment because she has been a great advocate for the United States, for all people who agree with our view of innovation and entrepreneurship and digital opportunity. And so I'm really proud of the work we did there as well, just making sure that the United States had a seat at the ITU, which is going to be very important for years to come. So anyway, Chairman Janikowski, in many respects, including this one, was quite right. The international work is fascinating, and it does take a lot of time, and it's not easy, but if you put in the work, it can be really rewarding for the Commission and for the country.
Where do you see the security issues on 5G, both in terms of network equipment and software and applications that are being developed? How has this played out?
I think that there are two different strands of the answer, for me at least. One is the governments around the world and companies recognizing that we do need a risk-based framework, and we need to think about the equipment that we incorporate into these networks very carefully. Obviously, some of the moves that we made in terms of prohibiting companies from using USF funds for Huawei and ZTE equipment is one aspect of that. But I think broadly speaking now, it's going to be important for us to continue that sort of macro conversation about the importance of securing networks at the beginning of deployment as opposed to trying to patch on security protocols after the fact, which is going to be very difficult and very expensive. But the other aspect of it, which I think is also important, is that we should place a priority on innovation. I mean, we can also innovate our way out of some of these problems. And what I mean by that is, if you look at how wireless networks historically have been constructed, you have companies that are full stack vendors. I mean, they make all of the equipment and they go to the wireless companies and they say, we will build you this network and we're going to manage it for you. We know how all the equipment is configured and we're the ones who hold the keys to security, et cetera. And they have long-term contracts with these companies. They lock you in for 20, 30 years potentially. And the wireless companies don't really have a lot of options because it's a pretty consolidated marketplace. And so, yes, through brute force regulation, the FCC or the US government could try to change that. But another way to change is by innovating our way out of the problem. So now, there's a lot of software-based network infrastructure companies doing some great work, and in particular, open radio access network companies, many of which are based here in the United States, that are doing incredible work, essentially virtualizing the wireless infrastructure that historically had been physical. And so if you can simply use software, cloud-based software to manage a 5G network, all of a sudden you've reduced the cost element for the wireless companies, you've commoditized it so they can pick and choose which vendors they like, so they hold the keys to security. And thirdly, you also promote so many more alternatives so that people recognize now, okay, there's going to be, we have many, many options. And so I'm really bullish about some of the companies in this space. And that's part of the reason why in 2019, the FCC held the first ever Open Radio Access Network Forum at the FCC. And we brought in great companies like Rakuten and Mavenir and Altiostar to talk about this virtualization. And it seemed kind of pie in the sky at the time, but I had a feeling that, look, this is going to be a really big deal. And we're still in the early stages, of course, but now you're seeing companies actually relying heavily on this. And Dish, for example, has signed deals with Rakuten and other O-RAN vendors, and companies around the world are relying on it as well. So here too, I have a feeling that innovation could be much more of the solution than some of the blunt force regulatory work that the FCC might do.
Some of the companies, some of the major global companies, both in terms of network equipment, but increasingly, I would say also online companies. There's what might be called trade wars. So we have, and the United States has generally been open, and in fact, recently I read that the largest online company is now TikTok.
Yeah,
Chinese company. It's displaced Google as the #1 online company in the world. But at the same time, there's certain countries, and China is probably high up on that list, that block outside companies from providing services in those countries. How do we address these trade issues, particularly in terms of online services, which increasingly are large parts of economies, and how do we address that?
Boy, I wish I knew the comprehensive answer to that question. I think it begins with a recognition of the threat to the open internet that we originally envisioned back in the 1990s when it was commercialized. I mean, I think the entire promise of the internet was that it was decentralized and that your access to information did not depend on the particular jurisdiction in which you sat. Whereas now, I think it's quite clear to most reasonable observers that China is essentially trying to create a walled internet, that the internet economy within China is quite distinct from the internet economy outside of China. And picking certain national champions early on or blocking foreign companies, especially those from the United States, from entering, it's quite disturbing. And it's disturbing, obviously, from an economic perspective. I don't think mercantilism has served anyone well, least of all consumers and other foreign competitors. But even beyond that, I mean, just using this as a tool to cement the Chinese Communist Party's dominance of the state, and it's not a positive future for those like me who do believe in the promise of an open internet, and who also believe that every company should have a free and fair chance to compete, as they do in the United States. And that's every single day or week, it seems like another story comes out about China restricting the ability of this or that company to enter the Chinese market. In fact, just recently I read an article about Disney, which had 4 Marvel films that it was seeking to enter, to distribute in the Chinese market. And the Chinese Communist Party censor said, no, we're not going to let you do any of them, despite the fact that Disney had been lobbying them very hard, had changed some of the content, as I understand it, to reflect the Chinese audience as the government thought was necessary. And I mean, that's just part of and parcel of where things are going. And I spoke about these issues a lot when I was at the FCC, even those beyond the telecom sector. But when some of the NBA issues were flaring up, and I said, look, if they're willing to take this aggressive action because of what a general manager for the Houston Rockets says, what do you think they're going to say when it comes to 5G security networks, or exploiting data that's collected on TikTok and things like that? I mean, it's an iron fact that the Chinese national intelligence law has a section that requires companies subject to Chinese jurisdiction to comply with requests from the intelligence services. Another section of that law prohibits any recipient of such a request to disclose the fact of the request. And so, I don't care what they say publicly, but if a company like TikTok is subject to Chinese jurisdiction and they get such a request, do you really think they're going to resist that request at the end of the day? I'm not so confident of that. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure where things go, but I do think that a bifurcated internet or balkanized internet is not in the long-term interest of consumers. And so I think it's important for the United States government, the FCC, State Department, other officials, White House, to call it out, to say what the lay of the land actually is, because if we're not willing to describe the situation honestly and forthrightly, I don't know how we're ever going to come to appropriate solutions. And I think most people in the United States now, Democrats and Republicans alike, agree, implicitly at least, on the nature of the problem, but I don't think there's, as of yet anyway, a consensus on the solution. And I certainly don't have a silver bullet either. So we'll see. But it's very disturbing to me.
Well, I could go on all day asking you questions, and I would very much like to do that, but I know I should honor the value of your time. And I want to thank you for joining us here at Hudson. I just want to have one little final question is,
Sure.
Do you miss the FCC?
Oh, I really do, in some ways. What I do miss is just getting to see my coworkers. I still very vividly remember sitting around a conference room in my office on March 13th of 2020. And the world we suddenly recognized was transforming. And we thought, okay, we're going to issue an order that we're all going virtual for a couple of weeks. We'll come back in a couple of weeks and that'll be that. I never set foot in the FCC again in a meeting. It never happened. I never got to see my coworkers. There was a tradition of chairs hosting a meeting in the commission reading room where they would say goodbye to all the commission employees. And I love the FCC staff. I really do. I miss going to some of the bureau and office holiday parties. I miss going to retirement celebrations. I miss some of the other things, that just seeing people in the hallway and asking how their kids were. I mean, that part of it I really, really miss. And I think I hope one aspect of my legacy, at least internally at the FCC, for those who may remember me long after I'm gone, is that I really cared about the FCC staff. I genuinely love the work they did and value them. And I said it when I was in office until I was blue in the face, and I'll keep saying it. To me, at least, they are the crown jewel of the federal government, just incredibly devoted. They could be making a lot more money out in the private sector, but they do what they do best on behalf of the public interest, and I really miss that. The other issue I kind of miss, in a way, just the rush of issues coming at you every single day and having to make decisions and set the agenda and explain the agenda to the public and defend it on Capitol Hill and all of that. But at the end of the day, I think as Gandalf said to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, all that's left to decide is what to do with the time that's given to you. And the first day I got the job, I remember thinking, it's going to be a 4-year sprint. Chairman Powell told me this in my first week. He gave me, I don't know if you are aware of this, he gives every chair sort of a 3 or 5 page memo, I can't remember what it is, and sort of a Powell's lessons from the chairmanship. And one of them on the last page is, don't blink because it goes fast. And I remember internalizing that, thinking, you know what, I want to really make this count. I want to sprint to the finish, do everything I can, and then hand the baton to my successor. And so I'm sure that Chairwoman Russell and all who come after her as well are going to do their best to carry the baton forward. And so anyway, I do miss some aspects of it. Some I don't, but overall, it was just the ride of a lifetime. And if you had told me, dorky, shy, awkward, half mustachioed Indian kid in the late 1980s, that the president of the United States would tap you to lead this great agency, I never would have believed you, but I would have wanted to believe you because I just thought that's what America is about. And so we're very grateful to have had the chance to do my part for the American people. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but
no, it was a great
I really love the agency and love the people there. So
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today at the Hudson Institute. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Harold. It's a pleasure.